Hey guys, Dr. Tobisch here again with Whitefish Chiropractic. Spring is right around the corner, which means a lot of us are going to be getting outside, doing some yard work and some spring cleaning, likely stressing our bodies in ways that we haven't in a while. And this typically leads to a big influx of people showing up at the clinic with an acute onset of back pain. Now that doesn't mean that yard work and spring cleaning automatically results in low back pain. It just means that the way that we do things is really important. And if we understand some of the mechanisms that result in low back pain, that'll help us avoid the things that are going to increase our risk of injury so we can get through all that yard work and stay pain-free in the process. So next up, let's talk about some of those mechanisms. I have this little spine model here, and today I specifically want to talk about flexion in the low back and how that can increase our risk of injury. So in this little model, you can clearly see the disc material depicted. So if we're rounding or flexing too far forward, obviously we can have a disc injury. We push our disc material backwards, overstretch things, and we get a little disc problem. What you can't see on this model is there are also a lot of connective tissues and muscles here in the posterior side of the spine. So if we're here, yes, we're crushing our disc a little bit, but we're also stretching and straining all the tissue on the backside of the spine. So the next thing I want to talk about are two things that are really going to increase our risk of injury in the low back, which is going to be excessive load and excessive duration. So by excessive load, I just mean the objects that we're picking up, the heavier and the larger that they are, while we're lifting them with this poor spinal position of the low back flexed forward, well, that's going to increase the stress on the front of the disc. It's going to increase the stress and tension on all these structures in the posterior part of the spine. So we obviously want to avoid this excessive load. We want to keep the spine in a neutral position when we're lifting heavy things. Now, excessive duration. That just means the longer we're in this poor position, well, now it's like there's stress and tension on these structures for a longer period of time. There's stress and pressure on the front of the disc for a longer period of time. That's going to greatly increase our risk of injury to all these tissues in the low back. So now that we've talked a little bit about these mechanisms, next up, we're going to go over some spine sparing strategies so we can avoid that excessive load and excessive duration so you can stay pain-free, get all your yard work done. All right, guys, next thing we're going to look at is going to be spine sparing strategies for lifting. I don't want you to think that anytime we flex around the low back that you're going to get injured or something like that. We should be able to move freely. We should be able to bend over and tie our shoes. But the greater the load or the heavier the object that we're trying to lift, the greater the risk of injury for the structures in our low back. So that just means when we're lifting heavy objects, we need to have really good form or really good technique to keep our low back safe. So first I'm going to show you an example of what we don't want to do. So say this trash can is a heavy object that I need to pick up. I get up to it, round my back, and then go to stand up. That is going to greatly increase the risk of injury to all these structures in the low back. So instead, we need to work on keeping the low back of the spine in a good neutral or relatively straight position. And instead of moving at the back, we move at our hips. So instead of rounding the back, we could come up to the object, keep our spine in a good position, kind of push my pockets back to get into my hips so I keep my back in a good position. And I can grab the object, sit back into my heels, and stand up with it. If the object is really heavy, another option would be you could approach the object and get down onto a knee, pull it in close, then stand up with it. So in both of those, we're keeping our back in a good position using our hips instead of our spine. All right, guys, next thing we're going to look at is going to be avoiding flexion in the low back for long durations. So again, it's not that you can never slouch around your low back. We all end up in those positions from time to time. But to reduce our risk of injury, we need to be aware that we can't spend a ton of time in those positions. So to avoid spending a lot of time in this flexed low back position, we need to have some movement variability and we need to take micro breaks. So if you're sitting on a chair and you're working on something in front of you and you end up in this position with your low back rounded, just be aware that we need to move. We need movement variability. So after a period of time or a couple of minutes, change positions. Maybe take a knee. Keep your back in a better position. Work on it from here. Switch to your other knee. Movement variability. The other thing, like I said, we need to take micro breaks. So we can't spend all this time with our back rounded. So if we know that we've been in that position for a while, get up and do some of the opposite. So get up, take a little break from whatever activity it is that you're doing, and do the opposite. Take your hands, push some extension into your low back. Knock out 8 to 10 of these, and then get back to whatever you're doing or move on to another task.